Okay, so I'm laying out the top and the bottom of the quilt. I'm trying to balance out my colors. So one of the things that you'll do when you lay this out is sometimes you can take a picture. I sometimes take a black and white picture. That helps me see things. Like I wouldn't want to have in my preferably randomly, as random as unrandom gets, kind of quilt layout. I might want to put something different there. And that might even be too dark because it kind of pulls the darkness going that way. So you can always flip things around until you find it the way that you like it yourself. So like that might work really well, except then I have two plaids in one end. So I might flip flop this one. And eventually you'll get to something that looks random yet planned. Okay, let's put the side rows together. So the first thing you're going to do after you've gotten them all ironed out is you're going to lay them pretty side to pretty side. And once you lay them pretty side to pretty side, you're going to want to pin every single seam. Now they can nest if you iron them correctly, but they don't have to at this point. You're just gonna get the rows together. And really, if you sewed really good 1/4 inch seams here, then everything will line up really well because these are charm packs, so they were pre-cut. So let's get all of these pinned and then let's sew them all together. So the panel, I decided to add a little border. So when I was showing you that quilt math earlier, remember I said, well, I'm just going to cut off 1/2 inch. Well, instead of cutting off a 1/2 inch, I thought I'll just add a little border. Now, when I did it, I added a 1 inch border, when that means that I took off 1/4. So it's a 3/4 inch border. The other thing is I mismeasured the length of this, so I needed it to be just a hair longer so that I didn't have to add or subtract any blocks. So think this is going to work okay. I also think that adding a little border like this onto the edge of a panel gives it a nice finished look when you're adding other things to it. And I love a small border like this. So it's only 1 inch, which means it's only really going to be about a 1/2 inch border. So it just looks like a little line. It looks fantastic. Okay, so y'all know on my corners, I need a 14 by 14 block because I've got to have this going this way and then this one goes this way. So basically it's like a cornerstone, so something that goes here. And I went ahead and taped it off on my fabric board, my cutting board, so that we could kind of think through some ideas of how to finish that off. Now I could do a solid color. I have a few solid colors that I have enough fabric to do at least 2 blocks. So I do 2 in one color and 2 in another. I could totally do that. It would look fine. I could also take some of the scraps that I had from doing the last quilt and start to lay out and say, okay, if I had this in the middle, which right now it's like a 9 by 7, and I have 4 of them because I made some blocks with it. If I did this in the middle, what could I do around the edges to give it something? I also have some of these. So you just kind of play with it to figure out what you want it to look like. So I might take these blocks. Now there's little bits and pieces of seam allowance and everything else, but it's just fun to kind of lay out and play and think, what could this look like? I could even take it out and I could go like this or like this and make little half square triangles on the sides. And then I could take some of the other solid blocks and kind of mix them in to give it just something different on the corners, as opposed to just a solid piece of fabric. So there's lots of different ways to lay it out, and I'm going to try to just play with this and I'll record it. And okay, so I figured it out, and I'm not going to lie, my little invention here made it super duper easy to play. So basically, really it made it so I didn't have to use a lot of pen and paper. So it made it real visual when I had to lay things out. So I figured out, I cut this center block down just a little bit so that it would fit with 2 inches on top and 2 inches on bottom and 3 inches on the side. So it's basically a rectangle. Then I found this. I had enough of this wood grained looking fabric to do the sides. Then I had this fantastic little words. Now this is directional, so I don't think it'll cause me any issues, but I'm gonna have to lay out all my blocks real particularly so that they're all facing up. But it ends up being kind of a cute little corner piece for my quilt. Sewing the tops on, I decided that'd be easiest. And then I'm going to sew my little cap blocks, which are super duper cute and went together really, really easy, and used up a lot of my scraps that I have from this. So all you do is line it up, make sure your ends line up. We measured this pretty well, and with adding this little bit of a border, it now measures perfect. Don't have to trim anything anywhere. Don't think that'll be so forgiving on the sides, but we'll see. I think it'll all work out fine. Okay, so this is how it looks so far. I've got my panel in the middle, and then I put that nice little 1-inch border around the edge. And when I sewed on both sides, it ends up being about a 1/2 inch in the middle. I've got the nice blocks on top. You can already see that this is going to be a nice long quilt. Now I'm going to take my blocks that I just made, and I'll sew them, nope, like this. I'll sew them to the side strips, and it will look really cute. My little block was really good, except I didn't account for seam allowances. So now my cute little block is short. It's short, which means I'll have to put a border on it or trim things. So I've got to decide if I'm going to put a border on it or trim things. Okay, so the quilt is done. It's cute. It has some little offs, and I'm going to show those in some pictures here in a minute. I'll put the details up. I'll post something somewhere so you guys can see how to do this. I did a couple of things that I wish I wouldn't have done, but worked in some ways and didn't work in others. So y'all knew I was off by 1/2 inch up here, and I was like, well, I'll just trim it. Or no, it was on the sides. And I was like, well, I'll just trim it. Then I thought, well, I'll just add a border because that'll make it work, which did make it work for up here, but then threw off all my measurements on the side. And instead of redoing all my measurements after I did it, I just improvised, which happens. Then you all saw the saga of the cornerstones. The cornerstone saga was funny, kind of, but basically I laid all that out in a 14-inch block, but then I didn't take into account my seam allowances. After further review, I probably wouldn't have had enough fabric to do the internal anyway. So I guess it kind of worked out, right? Next, I added a trim piece. Now I added a trim piece, then I trimmed a trim piece, then I took off the trim piece, then I put on the trim piece. Anyway, I ended up with a trim piece, and the trim piece would have worked because you can see this corner works. I'll give you some zoom ins and stuff like that. However, this corner is just a hair off. And then I had to add another row of blocks to make everything fall into place, because that's how crazy this quilt got. After I added a row, I realized I had to cut off 2.5 inches. So those are 5-inch blocks I added to the base. So instead of 7, I had 8, and then I had to cut 1.5. Which kind of broke my heart because I was trying really hard not to do that. But then I thought, you know what? I just want to be done, and done is better than perfect. So it is adorable, and it will serve its purpose well as my fall quilt. So there you have it. Okay, so this is what I wanted it to do. I wanted a nice corner. This is what ended up happening because I was off all over the place. Now, yes, I should have trimmed this one more right here. And I could have trimmed this just a hair more to make it work. But somehow I got up here. Sometimes I just look at my quilts and I think, bless my heart, I'm glad nobody is judging me on perfection. And I'm glad you guys like me regardless of whether my quilts are perfect. And if you don't like me because my quilts aren't perfect, move on.